The combination of those factors, and one that is so high profile. We've just been hearing about the Teacher's Pet podcast, over 60 million downloads. Everybody had an opinion on this. So those factors together, this is a once in a career. I doubt I see a case like this again.
On the evening of the 8th of January 1982, a 33-year-old nurse sat down in her own house on Sydney's northern beaches and called her mother. She and her husband had been to marriage counselling that afternoon, and a friend had seen the two of them walking out of it hand in hand. She told her mother the counselling was helping. Everything was just going to be fine, she said. They made a plan to meet at a swimming pool with the children in the morning. She never arrived. 2 days later, a 16-year-old moved into her bedroom and began wearing her clothes and her wedding rings. It was 6 weeks before anyone reported her missing. 2 coroners found she had been murdered by someone she knew, and twice the state refused to charge anyone. The mother she called that night died still waiting. It took 40 years and a podcast to finally catch the monster. This is what happened. The counselling had been her idea. Things at home had been wrong for a while, and she was the one trying to fix them. That Friday afternoon they went to a session together, and afterwards a friend named Sue Strath saw them in the street. They were holding hands. Strath later told a court that Lynette seemed positive and hopeful about the future. That evening Lynette phoned her mother. Helena Sims said afterwards that her daughter sounded like she'd had a drink or two and that she was upbeat. Whatever had been wrong at home, Lynette told her, was going to come right. They arranged to meet the next morning at Northbridge Baths, a saltwater pool on the harbour, with the children and the rest of the family. Helena wrote the plan down. A Saturday at the pool with her daughter and her granddaughters, in the middle of a long summer. That call is the last time anybody in Lynette Dawson's family heard her voice. The next morning, Helena went to the baths and waited. Her son-in-law arrived with the 2 little girls. Lynette was not with him. He had an explanation ready. He said he had dropped her at a bus stop that morning so she could go to Chatswood and return some clothing. Then, at some point during the day at the pool, he said he had taken a phone call from her. She had told him she needed some time away from the family. That was all. She would be in touch. There is no record of that phone call. There is no witness to it. There is nobody who saw Lynette Dawson at a bus stop, on a bus, at Chatswood, or anywhere else on the 9th of January 1982, or on any day after it. He had another detail ready too, for later. He would tell police that the day before she left, Lynette had come apart a little, that there had been an upset over the children. It was the beginning of a version of his wife that he would keep adding to for 40 years, in which she was fragile and unhappy, and the sort of woman who might simply go. Helena went home that afternoon and waited for her daughter to call. She would still be waiting 19 years later. Lynette Joy Sims was born in 1948 and grew up on the northern beaches in a big, close family. She trained as a nurse and worked at the Warriewood Children's Centre, looking after other people's children during the day and her own in the evenings. She met a boy at a high school function in 1965 when they were both 16. He had an identical twin brother, Paul, and the two of them were big, confident, sporting boys who were going places. She married him in March 1970 at St. Jude's Church in Randwick. She was 21. He and his brother played first grade for the Newtown Jets through the 1970s. They were recognisable men in a small world. In 1975, the twins and their wives went on the ABC program Checkerboard to talk about how unusually close the two brothers were. Then he retired from football and became a physical education teacher at Cromer High School, a state school about 10 minutes from home. They built a house at 2 Gilwinga Drive in Bayview, at the quiet northern end of the peninsula, surrounded by bush and looking out over the water. Chanel was born in 1977. Sharon was born in 1979. By January 1982, Lynette was 33 years old, 12 years married, and racing a 4-year-old and a 2-year-old in the house she had helped build. 40 years later, a judge would go through her life in detail and say something plain about it. She appeared to adore her husband. She had made a series of plans for the future, and she did not have the financial means to support herself for any length of time. All of which, the judge said, made it extremely unlikely that she would walk away from any of it. In 1980, her husband began a sexual relationship with a 16-year-old girl in his physical education class at Cromer High. In court, she was only ever referred to as JC. She came from a difficult home. She had a stepfather the court described as violent and controlling, and she had turned to a teacher for support. He was 32. She was a schoolgirl in his class. He brought her into his own house. She started babysitting Chanel and Sharon. She spent weekends at Bayview, ate dinner with the family, slept in the spare room while Lynette slept down the hall. It was built in stages. A teacher who controlled her timetable, then her weekends, then her income, and finally her address. Every stage moved her closer to him and further from anyone who might have asked a question. By the end of it, she was living in the house of the man who marked her schoolwork. In October 1981, she moved in properly, and Lynette found out what was happening under her own roof. She discovered the two of them were sleeping together in her house while she was in it. Lynette put her out. Before she went, JC told the court, Lynette said one thing to her: "You've been taking liberties with my husband." Other students at Cromer High knew about the relationship. Some of the staff had noticed the attention he paid to her, the way she was always at his side, the way a 16-year-old had become a fixture in a teacher's family home. Nobody reported it. Nobody made a phone call. A schoolgirl was being used by a teacher twice her age in plain view of an entire school, and the school did nothing at all. Lynette wanted the marriage saved. That is what she was telling her mother, and what she was telling her friends. What she told a colleague at the childcare centre was something else. That colleague gave evidence at the trial. She said Lynette had told her that before one of those counselling sessions, her husband had grabbed her by the throat, and that he had said this to her: "If this does not work, I'm getting rid of you." Other witnesses described violence in that house too. A man tells his wife that if the counselling does not work, he will get rid of her. They attend the session on the Friday afternoon. By Saturday morning, nobody in her family ever sees her again. This was the marriage Lynette Dawson was trying to hold together in the first week of January 1982, and it is the reason her family never once believed she had walked out of it. On the 10th of January 1982, 2 days after that last phone call, the girl moved back into the house at Bayview. She was 16 years old. She moved into the bedroom Lynette had shared with her husband. She wore Lynette's clothes. She wore Lynette's jewellery. She wore Lynette's wedding rings. And she took over the care of Chanel and Sharon, whose mother had disappeared 48 hours earlier. Chanel Dawson was 4 years old. Her mother was not there in the morning. And by the weekend, the girl who used to babysit her was living in the house as though she always had. Nobody sat Chanel down and explained any of it. That was her January. The girl herself was a child too, placed in a dead woman's life by a man who had been her teacher since she was 16. He married her in January 1984, at that same house. She was 18. What the arrangement did to her would take her years to get out of, and she finally left him in 1990. Her husband did not go to the police in January. He did not go in the last week of January, or in the first week of February. On the 18th of February 1982, 6 weeks after his wife was last heard from, her husband reported her missing. By then he had already been asked where she was, more than once by her mother and her brothers and her friends. He had answers, and they kept changing. She had gone away to think, or joined a religious group, or left over trouble about her bank card spending. She had phoned him several times to say she needed space. Everything a woman takes when she leaves a marriage was still in that house. Her passport and her driver's license were in a drawer. Her jewellery and her clothes had not been touched, and neither had her bank accounts. Every single item of it was exactly where she had left it. Police checked the airports and the banks and pulled travel and immigration records. No conductor, no ticket clerk, no airline had any record of her, and nobody had processed a payment in her name. Since that night, not one member of her family and not one of her friends has ever heard from Lynette Dawson again. And in 1982, the case was filed as a missing person, not a suspicious disappearance. A missing person. A locally famous footballer turned schoolteacher told police his wife had gone away to find herself, and the file was opened on that basis and left to sit. Subscribe so you don't miss how a podcast found what 40 years of police work couldn't. The investigation ran on and off through the 1980s and the 1990s and got nowhere. Detectives knew what they thought had happened and could not prove it. There was no body and no scene and no forensic evidence of any kind because there was nothing to test. In 1991, detectives flew to Queensland and interviewed him again at a police station outside Brisbane after his second wife had come to police with what she knew. He answered their questions. Nothing changed. He kept teaching. He kept coaching school sport at schools across the northern beaches. He married again, divorced again, and eventually settled on the Gold Coast. Chanel grew up being told that her mother had left because she didn't love them anymore. She was 4 when it happened, old enough to hold a few pieces of a memory, and not old enough to make them into anything. Sharon was 2. She had no memory of her mother at all, and she stayed loyal to her father. Lynette's family had no contact with Sharon after Helena's funeral in 2001. That is what this did to one family. It divided the children against each other, and it kept them divided for 30 years. Meanwhile, Lynette's brother Greg and his wife Marilyn would not let it go. They talked to any journalist who would take the call. They wrote letters. They turned up. For most of those years, the answer they got was that there was nothing new, and nothing new was ever going to be enough. Helena Sims died in 2001, 19 years after the phone call. She never found out what happened to her daughter. She never got to bury her, and she never heard anyone charged. In February 2001, 19 years after Lynette vanished, a coronial inquest was finally held. Deputy State Coroner Jan Stevenson found that Lynette Dawson was dead and that she had been killed by a known person. In February 2003, a second inquest was held before State Coroner Karl Milovanovic. He went further than Stevenson had. He recommended that Lynette's husband be charged with her murder. The Director of Public Prosecutions, Nicholas Cowdery, declined. He had declined after the first inquest as well. The reasoning was the same both times, and on paper it was not unreasonable. Nothing physical, nothing recovered, nothing admitted, and a circumstantial case that a jury might not accept. So 2 coroners of the state of New South Wales examined this case, and both of them said out loud that Lynette Dawson had been killed, and that the person who killed was not a stranger. And twice, nobody was put on trial for it. Lynette's family went home from the second inquest with a coroner's recommendation in their hands and no charge in sight. A coroner cannot charge anyone. A coroner can only find facts and make a recommendation, and then hand it to the people who can. Lynette's family had done everything a family is told to do. They had waited, they had cooperated, they had campaigned, they had sat through 2 inquests. They had 2 official findings that she was murdered. And they had nothing that could put a man in a courtroom. 15 more years went by. Subscribe so you don't miss how one journalist finally broke it open. In May 2018, a journalist at The Australian named Hedley Thomas released the first episode of a podcast called The Teacher's Pet. Thomas laid the whole thing out, week by week, in an order nobody had ever put it in publicly before. He tracked down former students, colleagues, neighbours and friends, including people nobody in authority had ever thought to interview, and he put them on tape. It went to number 1 in Australia, the United Kingdom, Canada and New Zealand. It was downloaded around 60 million times. What made it work was not that Thomas found a body or a murder weapon. He found people. Witnesses who had been carrying something since 1982 and had never once been asked for it. Former students who could describe what everybody at that school had seen. Colleagues who remembered what Lynette had told them. The evidence had been sitting in people's heads for 3 decades. And the police work that would have collected it in 1982 was never done. In September 2018, police went back to the house at Bayview with a warrant and stayed 5 days. They ran ground-penetrating radar over the grounds. They searched around the swimming pool, which is where his second wife had told them to look. They drained the septic tank. They brought in a dog trained to detect blood. They found nothing. All of it 36 years too late, in a garden that had been landscaped and lived in by other families since 1990. There is a complication in this part of the story that deserves saying plainly. The lead detective on the case told the court he had been worried that the podcast might have contaminated the evidence, that witnesses who had spoken to a journalist first might no longer be reliable. That concern was real, and it was raised in open court. It is also true that without the podcast, nobody would ever have tested it. Detectives drove to a house on the Gold Coast on the 5th of December 2018 and arrested a 70-year-old retired schoolteacher at his front door, in front of his third wife. Police said afterwards that he had been calm and a little taken aback. Christopher Michael Dawson. He was extradited to New South Wales and charged with the murder of his wife. In June 2019, he pleaded not guilty. He had spent 36 years saying she walked out on him. He was going to say it in a courtroom. For Lynette's family, the arrest was the thing they had been asking for since 1982. It arrived 4 months after the final episode of a podcast from a police force that had been told twice by its own coroners exactly what had happened. When the trial opened in the Supreme Court of New South Wales in May 2022, before Justice Ian Harrison, there was no jury in the room. That was Dawson's own doing. His lawyers had tried to have the case stopped permanently because of the publicity, and lost all the way up to the High Court. So he gave up his right to a jury and asked to be tried by a judge alone, on the grounds that the podcast had made a fair jury impossible. The prosecution had no body, no weapon, no DNA and no crime scene. What it had was a pattern. A teacher sleeping with a schoolgirl. A wife who vanished overnight without contacting a single person who loved her. A 16-year-old in her bed within 48 hours. And a man who had told different people different stories about where she had gone for 4 decades without ever landing on one. The delay cut both ways, and the court had to account for that. Telephone records were gone, and so were bank statements and the employment records from Lynette's workplace. Witnesses had died. Memories had shifted across 4 decades. Australian law requires a judge to weigh that disadvantage in the accused's favour, and Justice Harrison did. The defence called 5 witnesses who said they had seen Lynette Dawson after 1982. Harrison examined each account and rejected every one as mistaken or untrue. Dawson did not give evidence in his own defence. On the 30th of August 2022, Justice Harrison spent about 5 hours delivering his reasons. He said the only rational inference was that Dawson had killed his wife. He described the account Dawson had given for 40 years as fanciful, and said the evidence against him was persuasive. He found Dawson had lied about what had gone on with his student, lied about wanting to save his marriage, and lied about the phone calls he claimed to have received. And he found Dawson had killed his wife so that he could have the girl without restriction, while keeping the house and everything in it. Of the woman the defence had spent months attacking, Harrison said this: he found her truthful and reliable. It had been 14,938 days since his wife made a plan to meet her mother at a swimming pool. On the 2nd of December 2022, Dawson was sentenced to 24 years in prison, with a non-parole period of 18 years. Justice Harrison treated the missing body as an aggravating factor. It had denied a family the ability to bury her. He said the unavoidable prospect was that Dawson would likely die in jail. Chanel Dawson stood up in that courtroom and spoke to her father directly. She told him that the night he removed their mother from their lives was the night he destroyed her sense of safety and belonging in the world for decades to come. And then she asked him a question. Why didn't you just divorce her and let those who loved and needed her keep her? Lynette's brother Greg told the court they had accepted Dawson into the family without reservation, and that he had repaid them by committing what he called the ultimate betrayal. Her sister Pat said that not having a grave to go to had cruelly kept her clinging to a modicum of hope for 40 years. The conviction was not the end of what he answered for. In June 2023, Dawson was convicted of a second crime, carnal knowledge by a teacher. The offence that existed in 1980 for what he had done to a 16-year-old in his own care. Judge Sarah Huggett delivered that verdict, and Dawson swore repeatedly in court when he heard it. He appealed. In 2025, the appeal was dismissed. And at some point in the years he spent insisting his wife had walked out, he told one of his daughters that he had seen her mother in the audience of an episode of Antiques Roadshow. After the verdict, some commentary suggested the prosecution had finally happened because of public pressure. The Director of Public Prosecutions put out a statement rejecting that, saying decisions to prosecute are made independently of media coverage and public sentiment. Both things can be true. The office decides on the evidence, and the evidence in 2018 included dozens of witnesses nobody had ever interviewed. In June 2024, the Court of Criminal Appeal dismissed his appeal against the conviction. In June 2025, the High Court refused to hear him. It is finished. His first possible release date is August 2041, when he will be 93. The case did change something. It fed a national argument about coercive control that has since produced new law in Australia, and it forced a hard look at how police handle a missing woman when a charming man supplies the explanation. He has never once said where she is. On a Friday evening in January 1982, a 33-year-old nurse called her mother and said everything was going to be fine. She had a marriage she was trying to save, 2 small daughters asleep down the hall, and a plan to take them swimming with their grandmother in the morning. The pool at Northbridge is still there. The house at Bayview was sold a long time ago. Her family got a conviction and a sentence and an answer to the question of who. What they have never had, in more than 40 years of asking, is her. If this case stayed with you, leave your thoughts in the comments. More solved cases in the playlist.